simple mesh object. And essentially what I want to show you guys is, oops, sorry, I want this to be 10 by 10 by 1 by 1. Okay, so it's a simple single poly object, okay? And what I'm going to do as well is rename this to low poly. Usually I just call it low poly plane or something, very, very simple naming. And I'm going to, yeah, I'm recording it right now. So I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate that. So I've got a second copy, and this one I'll call high poly. Oops, high poly. So this one I'm going to model a little bit, okay? So I'm going to take this face. Actually, hold on a sec. I'm going to show you guys one other trick here, by the way. If you zoom in, I'll turn off my grid as well. So I want to select the high poly. If you have a hard time, I find Maya can be tricky where you're trying to select one thing, it selects a background thing. The shortcut to isolate an object is Control-1. I've also got this little handy tool that pops up so you can sort of see those shortcuts. So not Control-W, Control-1 will isolate this. And you see it kind of creates like a little selection set for that. So my whole idea behind this is to just show you guys, we can hit Control-E to extrude, right, which gives you some controls to pull up and maybe to scale inwards. Yeah, which I usually just do actually with the offset. I find it a little bit better to be a little bit more uniform. Okay. So we've got that. I also like just using Shift and Scale. So you can do Shift, left click and drag. Right? Or you can do Shift and Move as well. Will kind of allow you to kind of create some other mesh. Okay, so we've got this new model, right? I'm going to hit Control-1 to de-isolate. For some reason, it looks like, I don't know what happened to my other one. It's just to show all. Yeah, for some reason, my low poly got screwed up. Okay, so I'm going to, there. Okay, sorry, it's back. Okay, so I'm bringing this down. Typically, there's a few things you need to make sure of. You don't want any scaling on your object because this scaling is recorded in Maya. So that's one important issue. So both objects should have a scale of 100%, not 50% on one and 100% on another, because those scales will actually kind of get reset. So if, when you export to calculate a texture map, this will get a little bit screwed up. So that's one thing. The other thing is both objects should basically have the same pivot, which would be ideal. So I'm going to move this thing back up. So this thing had a pivot here. This thing has one here. I may, in fact, turn the grid back on. So that's right at the center of the grid. That's fine. I can take this, hit D, which activates the Move Pivot tool. And if you hold X, it'll snap to the grid, which I believe should be right there. If you hit 4, we can see that's perfect. And then hit D to deactivate the pivot movement. So we click on either one, right? Pivots are the same. If you take a look, though, right, there's actually still a bit of a translation because I did move the low poly pivot. So again, it's important that you delete history. I'll talk a little bit about that. Remove scaling, absolutely. So I'm going to go to modify, freeze transforms, and freeze transforms basically makes that look like 0. Now, normally I would do a delete history. So the shortcut for that is Control-D to delete history on that object. Or sorry, that's duplicate. I always forget the shortcut. Was it Shift Control-D? No. Shift D. I gotta jog my memory on this actually. Modify, and I'm sorry, edits, deletes by type history. Alt Shift D, sorry, was the combo for that. So that kind of just wipes out the history on that. So again, let me just make sure I actually did in fact freeze. And you can also go to bake pivot as well, which will kind of set the pivot to that, make sure it stays at 0. Yeah, so history, I often do a lot of history deleting and stuff as well. So what I'm going to do is export each object now. So I'll just take my plane and say, usually though, I'll say this, I actually kind of like to make sure my plane is somewhere in the middle of the shape of this other object. So I'll again hit D, hold X, and just kind of snap back up there. Then again, I'll just go back and refreeze and then just bake. In this case, since I'm just doing a simple export, I'm not going to worry about the history so much. So go to export selection, and I think I have it on my D drive somewhere. Yeah, plane, low poly, this one, file, export selection, my poly. Now I use a free program called Xnormal. So it's free to download and it's actually fairly easy to use. I'll just make sure this thing is installed. Okay. So it looks pretty old school, but I find for just quick exporting of normal maps, basically a normal map is going to compare. So I'm going to remove these old meshes that are in here. It's going to compare the two surfaces. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this works, and we'll see, intentionally, we're going to see one error that's going to pop up. Low poly plane. Yeah, low poly plane. Okay. So essentially in the baking option, so you basically right click and add a mesh, which is going to be your high poly, and then you right click and add your low res mesh, which is going to be the low poly plane. And then under baking, I think by default it's just the normal map is enabled. I usually just stick, give this thing a name. Plane is fine for this. Targa is something I usually typically use for normal maps. And you pick your resolution here, and I usually keep these two numbers the same. And so what it's going to do is just compare the surface. So it's going to kind of bounce lighting between the plane and the one with more detail. And you're going to see, right, this kind of like little multicolored normal map get created. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just take the flat plane, slide it over. I'm also, typically I also like to kind of change the materials here. So I may just switch this or assign a new blend. So I typically like to have a kind of shiny dark gray material on my objects. Yeah, let's maybe make the color a little brighter, and there we go. Okay, so we can kind of really see some nice reflectivity there. And I'm going to assign just a new blend of this, new material blend, mainly because I'm going to be putting in the bump map. So in most cases, you're going to go into bump map, click on the little checker, checker option. And then we go to file. I usually will set this setting over here to tangent space normals. I'll talk a little bit as well about bump versus tangent space normals, or normals is basically the short form everybody refers to. Click on file and load my map that I just baked out, which is this one. Okay, so I'm going to load that. And if you have 6 on your keyboard, you will see kind of like a little material preview. Okay. So this thing, right, we can sort of see like a fake, it's sort of a fake aspect of this object. And one other thing I should mention, if you go back into the normal settings where you loaded the file, you will have to go down and set this to raw, and you'll get a much more realistic appearance. So you see the color changes, and it actually becomes much more like that surface. So, if this was a little architectural element that was repeated thousands of times, hundreds of times, and it's way back in the distance, you can make a very low res texture of this, maybe a 256 pixel, 1/10 the size of the 2K res, and have it look really detailed from a distance, So there's a lot of kind of great cheats and uses for normal maps. Now you might notice there's an issue here, right? The problem is this. We have kind of like a little angled surface, and I might actually just exaggerate this a little bit more, right? So this surface is raised, and what's happening is these angles are being picked up, right? These flat ones may be less so. They're still kind of showing up, but this thing isn't, right? We see like it's just a flat face. What we're not getting is this. And there's a reason behind that. So if we imagine we're looking at the planes from a side view, I'm going to be drawing this with the mouse, so please forgive the crappy drawing. So there's the flat plane, and then I'll kind of draw, the box. Now the term normal map, we're going to pretend that's perfectly straight. Right, so what's actually happening is the two surfaces are being compared. So what happens is light gets shot between these two. So because these are parallel to each other, right, this is flat. Oops. right? This is flat, right? So this blue part is pretty flat. This is pretty flat. They're parallel to each other. There's no sort of difference being picked up. So that's one issue, right? These two surfaces will kind of look the same in the normal map. They'll be kind of neutral. But because when the light shows up here, it's like, oh, there's an angle. You see? So those angles are calculated. And because these polygons are perfectly straight on that little extrusion I did inwards, there's no calculation. There's no angle to pick up. So you have one of two options. One is to actually round the sides through beveling, right? So you can round these things out, or you can taper this thing inwards, right? So you can sort of scale it in. So I'll show you what that would look like. Let's say I take this, I scale it in a little bit. So now we have more faces, more angle for that to be picked up by the normal map calculation. So I'll just re-export this that selection at low poly plane. We'll go back to here, generate map, and we'll see it update, right? Oops, I think I made a mistake there. I knew it. It actually should have been my high poly. So I'm going to go export. High poly plane, yes. And I'll re-export that one. Let's just make sure, again, I want to make sure it's in the center of the world. So I'm just going to zero it out for a sec. Export selection, low poly plane, okay. And then we'll go back here. And this should show us now, right? We'll actually see those angles being picked up, right? Because there was no issue. So now if we take a look, I will probably need to just jump back into the blend, and sometimes you have to go back and hit the reload, and there you see, right? Now, this is a little Maya bug that bugs me, but when you reload, you have to reset your sRGB color space to raw. But now, right, we get a reasonable fake imitation of that surface. It's pretty cool, right? So yeah, if you want to preview this, you can actually go into rendering and just kind of add a simple point light is okay, and then hit number 7 on your keyboard. And if you take a look, what's really cool about something like this normal map is that you see this angle, right, which is facing the light, is picking up a highlight, and the one that's unable to face that light is casting a shadow. So we actually get semi-realistic or fairly realistic lighting and shading. Just to kind of make another note about this, the old version of this, we prior to bump maps, we had, prior to normal maps, we had bump maps. And bump maps are basically black and white images that simulate a surface being higher or lower than the actual mesh detail. And so it's like an early prototypical version of the bump, but it looks less realistic because it doesn't cast shadows the same way. It doesn't receive highlights the same way as the normal does, because the normal actually indicates direction, right? So not just up and down, but actually tilting of the surface, okay? And the bump is just like, it's raised or it's not, it's raised or it's indented or it's sort of somewhere in between or in the middle, right? So the bump isn't as, it's still useful. Sometimes people use a bump and a normal. Some people just use normals. If you're restricted by budget, you might just use a very small normal or just a bump or a small bump. But it's probably the most efficient and current technology for simulating, some of these details. And like I said, far more realistic. So a lot of people, if they have the choice between bump and normal and have to choose one, the normal is the better choice. Something else I want to mention. So let me just hit 5 so we kind of turn off our material preview. In 3D, each polygon, so normals, the term normals, it may seem weird, but the lighting and shading that we see in 3D, especially on lower poly objects, is actually a bit of a cheat or a bit of a fake. So if you ever notice when you create a sphere, right? Let's say we create a sphere. If we take a look at this sphere up close, it looks smooth, right? Like there's kind of a surface shape. Let me assign one of the blends, right? So it looks nice and smooth. There's a nice smooth highlight, But if you look at the silhouette, right, it's kind of a jagged silhouette. It's not actually that high res. So what's actually happening is from polygon to polygon, from edge to edge, from vertex to vertex, the shading information is being cheated and smoothed. So any shadows and highlights are being smeared across that surface. And the way to see the true surface is we go into mesh display, and you can go to harden edge. And that's what that surface actually looks like. So you see what I'm saying is it's very faceted, faceting meaning we can see each individual polygon or triangle. But that's what the object actually truly looks like. So Maya by default, when you have like a simple cylinder or cone or torus or sphere, is kind of applying this. It's almost like a smoothing technology without adding more mesh to the object, if that makes sense. So what's happening is, let me go back to soften for a second. I'll first start with the plane, and then we'll jump back to the sphere. If you go under display, polygons, I'm going to tear off the polygon panel so we can see this. You have this thing called Vertex Normals. And I'm going to go to normal size and just kind of crank this up a little bit. So right now you're seeing actually this is the direction in which the polygon is facing. So the backside, if we were to render this, would be invisible or it'd be dark. It would have no shading information, but this is telling the software that, hey, this is the side that's being lit, being rendered, being textured. And if we take a look at this guy and we do the same thing, I'm just going to click on Vertex Normals. Take a look. You see how they're split a little bit, right? Now, the split is actually indicating that, hey, this is supposed to look sharp at the corner, right? So this corner looks sharp. So that's what that smoothing is doing. If we take a look over here, I just want to show you guys this. If we go to Vertex Normals, so normals actually indicate the direction of lighting and shading received and cast by those polygons. So if you've ever seen somebody go into mesh display, we can actually reverse these so that they face inwards. And I think it's under shading. If I turn on back face cull, you see the normals are all pointing inwards, right? So there's some interesting tricks we can play where we have like an environment sphere like this, and it looks like we're inside the environment, but it's actually just a sphere with the normals flipped inside out. So that's partially where the calculations come from as well. It's not only the surface detail, but then what is happening compared to the low-res normals, the high-res normals, the actual modeling shapes. So it's a combination of all that stuff that's being calculated. So go back to mesh display reverse. Sometimes you'll see that. Maybe you import a mesh from a 3D site or a game or something, and you'll see things that look black or flipped. So you may just have to reverse them. Some look too jagged or hard edge. So you'll have to go from mesh display to soften to harden. So watch what happens, right? If we take a look at really, really close up, one vertex, because it's smoothing, it's averaging, right? This one vertex has one line, so it's smoothing. It's basically saying and showing you that the shading and highlights are smooth between here, right? And when we go to mesh display, harden edge, you'll see it split. Each one splits into four, saying, hey, when light hits this, we're going to see each and every edge. So I think that's also key in calculating your normal maps. So what's kind of cool about this is that we can actually play around with this in a way too. I'm going to just turn off the vertex normal so we can kind of just see what's happening with the mesh. So I can go back and say, let's soften edge, but maybe you want it to look like there's some panels. Well, you can double click this edge, maybe double click this one, and pick specific edges to have hard edges. And so then when we click off of this, right, it looks like it has a bit of a band. Now in this case, I feel like, maybe the normals aren't quite where they should be. So I might want all of these to look smooth and flat with one another. So I might say, okay, let's just soften the edges across here. But then I want all the corner edges and all these exterior edges. Everything where there's a sharp turn essentially is where I want to basically crease it or make it look creased. It's not technically creasing it, but it's making the edge look nice and sharp, hard edge. Okay. So then I think we get much, much better shading, right? Let's go into export our high poly plane. Try not to make that mistake again. And then we'll just generate again. It might come out a little bit better. Yeah, no, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted this top area to look nice and flat. And then let's hit 6, and there we go. See, we get the updated map. So I don't have this weird crease that was happening on the top there, right? Because the normals were being a little bit weird. So it's one way to kind of catch issues as well, is to sort of say, sometimes you'll see some weird hard edges that don't belong, or maybe some areas that should look sharp but are kind of smoothing in a weird way or look kind of smudgy. I'll show you a really simple example. And this happens sometimes, sometimes you import something or you do a couple cuts. Watch what happens. This thing has, right? all its normals are all split, and you can see that by the 3 points, right? There's, I think there's probably more than 3 points, but anyways, we're seeing each side is hard. If you just go into mesh and soften edge, you get this. And sometimes you will see that when you import a mesh. And that's a good sign to sort of say, hey, I think I either need to go into harden edge. There's another really cool feature where you can say soften harden edge, where you actually have a slider, or you can usually get the slider thing by clicking on this box. So you can say, oh, anything below 30 degrees will be smoothed. Anything above 30 degrees will be hard. I often do this as a quick way to kind of fix a lot of these issues. So I usually go in 15-degree increments. So 15, 30, 45, 60, 90. Sometimes I'll go one below because I don't, right? Watch what happens when let's say I set it to 60 and apply. Right, that fixes it because these things are all under 60 degrees. So these are all flat. And then anything over 60 gets hardened. Well, if I went to 90, that's within the range of this. This is a 90 degree. They're all 90 degree turns, right? So if I do that, or maybe 91, I think actually is the threshold. Yeah, right. So anything over 91, under 91 gets smooth, and this is a 90 degree. So that's sometimes a good way to kind of like automate this process and not do it by hand, is to say, okay, anything at 90, 60, 45, 30 should be sharpened or hardened. And again, it's a display cheat, right? It's just smoothing normals or making them look sharper. So there's the actual mesh normals, but then we have normal maps. And that's kind of where the terminology is connected.